Hello.
Hi there.
Nobody's clapping?
There we go.
So we all set? Good, yes.
Do these work? Hello, yes. There you go.
We had uncooperative microphones yesterday, but we have a professional show here today, so glad of that. So, yeah, all right. So some of you know me. I'm David West Reynolds, and I'm especially grateful to Wonderfest because I got my start here. And the people that run Wonderfest were the ones that brought me from the world of just marveling at the things that I saw on the screen to beginning to understand how they were made. And it was Lee Staten's class at my US in Star Wars and Star Trek that opened my mind to seeing the entertainment that I enjoyed as not just entertainment, but as also a craft that I could respect. And now to come into that and see it from behind the scenes as well, I still enjoy it just as much as entertainment, but to that is added the respect for the craftsmanship. So the start that I got from Wonderfest I always loved the worlds of Star Wars, and some of you will have heard the stories of how I ended up going to Tunisia as an archaeologist and tracking down the lost filming locations of the first Star Wars movie. That made me the only person in the world with the GPS coordinates of the Star Wars locations exactly when George Lucas needed them to go back and shoot the prequels.
That's awesome.
So that's how I ended up getting hired as a location scout for Lucasfilm, and they found that this kid is a walking encyclopedia of Star Wars, and that was just what they needed at Skywalker Ranch at the time. So they brought me in and had me start writing Star Wars reference books in a way that had never been done before. They wanted to flesh out the stories behind them, and they thought an archaeologist would be the perfect person to do that, who was also a fan. So I was able to provide all this information about the droids and the characters and the technology, and I had lots of ideas to unfold, and I had free run of Skywalker Ranch, which was a great thing. And because I had the protection of Rick McCallum, who's George Lucas's right-hand man at the time, I could get away with almost anything. And everyone else was worried about getting fired because you're working at Skywalker Ranch and it's amazing to be here. And I was just having a great time. So the archives, the film archives, anything. And so I wanted the books to be definitive. I wanted to have my information get people as close as possible to these handiworks that had been made that brought the universe to life for us. And I got that information about nearly everything. All the files were open to me. But when it came to the props, no one could answer my questions about, so who made this? Where did this come from? I'm seeing the blasters and all of this stuff in the archives, and questions that I'd had about the most iconic pieces of Star Wars, which have to be the lightsabers. And no one could answer that until the 4th of July picnic one year. George had brought back, for the prequels, someone that he'd worked with on the original trilogy. And this person had started out as a set decorator, but had grown to become a director, supported by George personally. George donated film for the leftover tales from shooting The Empire Strikes Back so that this person could make a short film, which is a pretty amazing way to get your start into directing. And this person was directing the second unit on The Phantom Menace. And I met him at the picnic, and I found out that he was Roger Christian. And I said, don't you have an Oscar for decorating the sets on Star Wars? And he said, I think I do, something like that. I said, well, maybe you could answer some of my questions. And
Some.
Many. His was the untold story. Charlie Lippincott, the publicist for Lucasfilm back in the beginning, had done a wonderful job of interviewing everybody he could talk to. So we got a lot of pieces of those interviews in the early publicity elements for Star Wars. So you see them on the back of the Topps cards and everywhere else. And the Making of Star Wars book was written largely on the transcripts from the Charlie Lippincott interviews. But Roger had been missed out. You were in England, and I guess Lippincott.
No, he interviewed me.
What, he didn't
And it got
cover
lost.
properly. Is
No,
it
it did.
got lost? Is that
No, it was lost. They never found it. And his wife has a copy of it. And she said, I've got hundreds of things, and I'm still at her to try to get it. I wanted it for the book, and she said, I've got so many, and when he died. So, no, it was lost. It was done fully, comprehensively, and I know that from Charlie.
So it was amazing for me to meet this person and have him say, oh sure, yeah, I designed that, I built that. And I'm still asking him questions 20 years later, because Star Wars was such an incredibly richly creative work that you can put that much attention to it. So I've gotten to ask him questions for 20 years worth, but now it'll be your turn, because this is the man who created those things and brought the used universe to life.
I did. We had with no money. That's the thing. Now I know why I've come out and he forced me to write the book, which I've written, and unfortunately the hardbacks are now finished and they're about to publish a soft cover, so I'm waiting to get those. But I realized as a legacy, and it had never been covered, that I'd better put it all down, that and Alien as well. And I was working on a film called Lucky Lady in Mexico, and it was a huge movie, and we were converting old Mexican buildings to running buildings. And Lucky Lady was written by Gloria Willard Hike, who wrote American Graffiti and wrote some of the characters for George uncredited in Star Wars. So they said, you've got to come down and meet George, Roger and John Barry, the designer, because Fox, I think everyone knows now that everyone turned this film down. No one wanted it. No one wanted a science fiction film. There was no box office. And Alan Ladd went against the Fox board and said, we're going to consider this. And so they estimated it would make $12 million at the box office. And they divided that by 3 and said to George, we'll make your film if you can do it for $4 million. Well, Gary was doing all of the kind of estimates in studios in America, and they were none free, and it came out at 8. The head of Fox in London picked up, and we needed work in England, and said, we can do it for 4, the exchange rates, and we've got empty studios. So that was it, and George came down, I was digging salt, making a salt factory. And being George, just George and Gary in his plaid shirt, jeans and white sneakers, that was what he always wore, and looked at this salt factory, and then I was shoveling salt, so being George, he picked up a shovel and started shoveling with me and said, I want to make this science fiction film, but I want to do it like a spaghetti western. And I was truthful. I said, listen, I've watched every science fiction film. I'm an avid reader of science fiction, which never went down well in England at that time. I was always told, it's not Shakespeare, is it? There was a kind of supercilious attitude to everything like that. And I said, George, I'm sorry, but everything I see is over-designed, it's all clean, it doesn't look real. No one goes to those movies to watch them, and I think it should be like an old ship that's dripping oil and being repaired by the owner and kept going. I only realized then, when I finally read the script in August when I was hired, that I described the Millennium Falcon exactly. I was watching it last night, and I remember, Luke saying, this is a pile of junk. And in London, we then found out how little money there was to make this film, and most of the art department said, this can't be done. We don't have enough time, because we were shooting in March, and this was January the 6th when we started. Well, for any film needs longer preparation than that. So I just thought, this is a dream job. I loved the script, and I knew a lot about mythology, so I recognized what was there. Fox still would not trigger the movie. We moved, George and Gary and myself and John Barry and one art director went into a tiny studio in England, and I'd done my breakdown of what's required and said, I can't do it, so I'm going to have to think outside the box here. And John Barry realized, and you probably all know, it's based on Hidden Fortress, Kurosawa's, 2 squabbling peasants. And the story is you don't know this film, the story is two squabbling peasants, one tall, one short. They get caught up in a war that's nothing to do with them. They're taken prisoner, they're dumped into a desert, they have a fight in the desert and split up, and they come together because a princess has to fight against a big, powerful overlord who's trying to take over her kingdom. That's Star Wars, exact journey. And so he'd taken, and those two peasants are the minor characters, but they tell the story. So he turned them into R2-D2 and C-3PO, and they are the storytellers. There was no CGI. You have to remember at this time there was a special effects department with very primitive radio control that they thought would always work, and we knew wouldn't. And so they said, we'd better try and make R2-D2 work, because if we don't make him work, we can't make the film. That was that kind of pressure on us. And we had no money. They wouldn't give us anything for materials, nothing. So I hired a carpenter who I'd worked with, who did all of the Monty Python movies, who literally had no money. And if you ever see the King Arthur story, they couldn't even afford horses. They had So Bill said to me, I've got some wood at home. So he went to the garage and got some wood.
This is Bill Murray, right?
Yeah, we made around R2-D2, and we thought the Daleks were very big then, and they were worked by little people in Doctor Who. So we thought, okay, if we put a little person inside, then we could probably make one work at least.
Now, Roger will downplay a lot of his contributions, but we should appreciate that R2 gets developed with George sharing his ideas with Ralph McQuarrie, who's just seminal importance in shaping the look and feel of Star Wars. And you see the early R2s, they're fishing around for what's the design of this character. The closest thing we'd had was the drones in Silent Running. So that's sort of R2's analog, where it's this thing that doesn't speak in human terms, but it clicks and it sort of gets a personality in the film. So they were trying to come up with what works for R2, and you'll see Ralph McQuarrie's sketches. Early on, there's like a big ball bearing underneath R2. And so they sort of end up playing that idea out with BB-8, right? But early on, R2 is just sitting on a big ball bearing. But how do you physically do that? And so then R2 ends up being a tripod, and you'll see in the famous production painting that Ralph did with C-3PO and R2 crashed in the desert, you'll see R2 is a tripod like he is in the film, but you'll see he's not traveling on treads. He's pitching himself forward. So the idea would have been this really awkward motion that would have been ungainly on film and probably prohibitively impossible to achieve in person.
We tried the three-wheeled one first, just stuck one in the front, but it broke off all the time. So we decided there had to be two. One was Kenny worked, which is the wobbling one and walking one, and the other one that would be radio controlled if it would work, the three-wheeled one. And we found Kenny Baker, who was 3'8", and we measured against C-3PO from that painting that he would be 4 foot. There were no drawings. I've got in the book, I've got one sketch that George did and Bill did, and we built it from that. There was no like normal way of doing things, beautifully drawn and how you work and everything. We just did it as we went along. Bill built a round cylinder. He said, I can't make a top roach, so I hunted around it was the lighting company who had lights for films, and they had a scrap heap, and I found a top, and I thought, you know what, that'll fit. So Bill took the stuff inside out, and we stuck that on the top, and then I thought, it doesn't look very good, so I went to a junkyard and got some Dakota lights from a passenger plane, and I stuck that in. That's still there.
The Dakota, is that, what kind of plane is that?
It was a passenger plane, early prop plane.
Okay, like a C-47 kind of thing?
I have no idea. I can't tell you. I just, whatever I liked, I took. It's all the fancy stuff now. When I wrote the book, I could find out what I did. To me, I just found things, and like a magpie, that was cool, that'll look cool, I'll figure out what to do with it. So, then Bill said, he has these arms on the front, I can't make those, Rog. He gave me a penknife and a bit of wood and said, go and carve one. So I did that at night at home. This is an illustration of how we made this film. Kenny turned up. We tried to lift him in. He was so heavy. He looked at both Bill and I and said, "Oh, I've got heavy bones." And, he was a comedy actor. They had a mini-tones with Jack Purvis. So we thought, okay, how can we do this? Because he couldn't move it, he couldn't do anything, and he could turn the top of it. And then we got his boots, and we stapled them inside the bottom of the legs, and he put his feet in the boots, and he still couldn't move it. And then this junk pile I bought, there was a fighter pilot's harness, so we stapled it inside, and he could wear Kenny wooden one like a rucksack. And George and Gary were there, and he took 3 steps before he fell over and was calling, "Get me out." It's, as I said, it's probably the most auspicious moment on Star Wars, because we knew we could make the movie. We knew we would be able to make him work with a bit more development, because we knew C-3PO Metropolis had Maria, and that was in 1927. We knew we could get a thin person and make that work and make it much better than before. So that's how R2 started life, and then it got handed over. Once the studios triggered us, that got handed to the special effects. At the same time doing that, my pet peeve with science fiction movies was weapons. And they were all lightweight plastic that kind of went beep beep, and I thought, no one believes this stuff. So looking at my budget, I thought, I can't make any, so I'll make them out of real guns, and I could rent those from the gun hire place. And I love the Sterling submachine gun. That, to me, was science fiction weapon. So I didn't tell anyone, because I thought this would be my test if I'm on the right tack with George now, to see if I'm making the same film he wants. So they set me up in the gun hire place. I got my buyer to buy some little T-strip rubber, and I stuck that round the barrel, because everything I had to change 10% or 20% because it was Star Wars. And stuck that round. I dug around, and they had some. They were from the army in Ireland during the riots, where they were night scopes, and they looked really cool to me. So I stuck that on the top, and we could fire. The gun could actually fire. So I took off the big clip. They had a little 1 bullet clip, and I stuck that on the side. And I thought, okay, so he's always talking about Han Solo being a cowboy. And I thought, what can I do as a cowboy gun? And I found this Mauser, which is, to me, it's beautiful. It's a World War II gun with a wooden stock. So I stuck more sights. This was all super glue at that time. And a flasher on the end. And then I kind of nervously called John Barry and said, you better bring George here, because he better look at what I've done, and then either I get fired and I'm off, or it'll be all right. And George came, and George is renowned for not saying much. I got a huge smile, that's the approval, and then he stayed with me, and we made Princess Leia's gun, and again, he got his figure. I was covered in super glue the whole time, because stuff's uncontrollable. And it started from there, and then Ralph McQuarrie had drawn Chewbacca with a blaster, and I'd found the bowcaster with the boards on the end, and I thought that's much better to suit him. So I showed George. Yeah, he did that. He changed the script. That went in.
But this was a huge change. The idea of going to the real world. That this, you talk about presenting it to George, and is he going to approve this? But it's so different than anyone had thought. Everyone pictures, well, the future is a different place, so we just have to make it from scratch. It's not going to look like here. And that's what you recognized as a set decorator, that it looks fake, it looks art directed. And so going to the real world and starting with that and then changing it, that was this perfect signature look for Star Wars, but it was so original to do that. And
yeah, I mean,
it's an extraordinary moment.
Look at all those science fiction films. For some reason, they were all dressed in Nero collars. They thought, oh, wow, this is cool. I mean, everything was nothing connected to an audience, you know. And if as designers, and if we do our job properly, nobody notices what we've done. So And I go into this on the documentary once we got it released to go out. I think being born in the middle of London when it was being bombed to hell, and I guess somehow I absorbed this kind of look of old destroyed London, and George liked, I only found out years later, I loved Alphaville, which was a Jean-Luc Godard film that he set in Paris with a little Bolex and made it look like an alien city. And that was one of George. He's got that poster in the ranch. It's one of the few he's got. I think, and when I was young, my dinky toys I collected, they always looked new and shiny to me, so I was always painting them down and trying to make them look more real. So somehow I had the DNA of doing this, and I just loved this script, and I wanted to kind of make this world that was a spaghetti western in space, really. And I mean, I tell this story, but it will explain. Nobody in the studios wanted the film. We finally went in the studio in January the 6th, and by then we were friends. George and I, we watched Silent Running at night. We had an old projector. We watched spaghetti westerns. We watched films together. And we developed R2-D2. We had to make the other one impossible, was the land speeder. So Bill had some wheelbarrows at home, and he bought 3 of the wheels. We built the land speeder with wheelbarrow wheels, which turned out to be way too big. And George came down and said, no, Luke should have a 2-seater, little sports car that's old and damaged. And John Barry quite rightly had designed it with R2-D2, C-3PO, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and Luke sitting in a nice, comfortable car. And he said, no, I'll fit him in. It should be a 2-seater. They got a Volkswagen, which are the ones that went to India, all the hippies used. They cut the top off, gave it to Bill Harmon, who was not a welder, but there was no other way to do this, and we knew it had to be 3 wheels, try and disguise the wheels. So he got an old motorbike, cut the front off, welded that on with George watching, saying, that's the worst bit of welding I've ever seen in my life. And he put on wings, built out of polystyrene, and they came to watch the first demonstration. George and Gary. And they drove it down, hit the wall, everything fell off it went down, and Gary Kurtz's wife made the classic comment. She said, this sure ain't Hollywood, is it? But the moment we got onto the big studio, Fox finally greenlit it and said, okay, we'll give you the money. And they laid out a table with all of my weapons I'd made, everything that we'd done so far, and the whole crew came in, all these supercilious British then, and they looked. Charlie Talbot, I remember him, the main prop man on the floor, he picked up my blaster, literally threw it at me and said, this is crap. This is crap. Don't you understand? We're doing a Hollywood movie for a big Hollywood director. And they went off to get me fired. And this whole film continued with that kind of attitude from then on. But I thought, you know what? I'm doing a dream job. We're friends with George, and I don't care. I'm quite stubborn like that. So we just got on and did it. And everything started to be developed. But I realized I couldn't make anything. And 2.5 months is not long enough. Where any normal film, like The Binoculars, you put it in, they do the drawings that go through the system and get made and come out the other end. I couldn't do that with anything. I just had to, like a magpie, got my buyer to get me any junk that he could find, and I collected it thinking, what could I use in the future? There was no way to know, oh, there's the binoculars, there's a lightsaber, there's this. It didn't exist. And the hardest thing for me was like the Millennium Falcon, because there was no time. John Barry designed it, and they would make the wooden structure. I had to put everything in it. And I'd been on a submarine, and I saw how crammed with stuff it is. I mean, every inch is used, and I'd been on a B-52 bomber, and every inch is used. So I thought, that's the way to do it. I got this crazy idea driving around London. If I bought airplane scrap, I could stick it in the sets. And again, I had to kind of go with my fingers crossed to George and Gary and John Barry and say, listen, I've got an idea. And I think because George had made THX, he understood my crazy idea to go with my airplane junk, and he just said, yeah, go and do it. And the first thing I did in EMI Studios, they flew me on a little prop plane around 4 airfields in England, and honestly, there were junk piles bigger than this room, higher like mountains. Rolls-Royce engines just piled up. No one wanted it. It was sold by weight, so metal merchants didn't want it. So it was a wonderland. I was buying so much stuff, and I don't think I spent more than 50 or 100 pounds on.
Wow.
So again, the reality of this, because I'm playing, this is going to work. I didn't know. You know, if you make a period film, you go to the museum or art galleries, and you look and books. You have everything. With this, there was no reference to go on. Nothing had been made. So we had a prop master who's in charge at the studio, who's a wonderful man, Frank. He did Stanley Kubrick's movies, he did David Lean's. I mean, he could move an army. He was an extraordinary human being. So he said, what do you want, boy? I was called boy. And I said, clear out this prop room. There's no chairs, curtains, there's no furniture, nothing. Clear it out. I'll tell you what we're going to do. So he did. This low loader backs in. He came down to look, standing by me. This low loader comes in. Roped on is like as much airplane junk as you could ever see, and there were jet engines stuck in there and everything. I'm standing there, and it drives in, and he says, you know, you're mad, boy. I thought, yeah. But this was Frank. He was one of the few supportive people on that film. He said, boy, in my office, I'm putting the tea on. I want you to tell me what you need to do. So I said, we need to train prop men how to break down. All these engines have got to be broken into components, because if you look at an aircraft, there's 2 or 3 duplicates. People have tried to stick it in. You can't do that, even Doctor Who. You have to layer it like engineering. So we, the first set we did was the Millennium Falcon cockpit. John Barry had hired Harold Lang, and to put this in perspective, to try and get the crew to understand what he was doing, George showed 3 films to the crew. The first one was Once Upon a Time in the West, which is Sergio Leone's classic Western. He was pointing out the dust and the dirt and the costumes, everything. 2001, obviously, because you have the contrast of Tatooine and the kind of organic nature of all of the lower rebels, and then the Death Star, which is the 2001 structured Cold World. And the third film was Satyricon, which completely confused everybody. But there are huge sets in it that are all aged, and but they're never pointed out. And George kept saying, I'm going to make a documentary, I'm not making a film. And he wanted to shoot it like a documentary to make it real. And nobody understood at all, but we kind of got stuck in, and he hired Harold Lang, who did 2001.
Who was brilliant for his control panels.
Brilliant, beautiful stuff.
One of his specialties was doing control panels.
Yeah.
So all of them, Discovery, cockpit, things like that, that's all Harold Lang.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see the contrast, as Roger's explaining. The Millennium Falcon cockpit, if you look closely, it's got that 2001 look, but you get into the hold, and the hold looks more wild and organic, and that's Harold Lang versus Roger Christian approach. And after he finished,
well, no, it was before that. I used to get out. See, I'd art school, and I was a rebel always, so I had hair down here and Cuban boots and the whole thing. He was like dressed in all the art department were suits and ties at that time. And I'd come in and I'd say, I'm going to mess this up. And he'd look at me and And eventually he said, okay, boy, do what you want. So I got fighter pilot seats, and I then got, we used one of the pistons from C-3PO, because I thought, oh, he's got to pull into hyperspace. How am I going to do that? We stuck that in, and that never worked. I had to ask Harrison to make that work for me. He was great. Harrison, I don't know if you know, he was a carpenter, and he came when he first arrived and said, is there anything I can do? And we said, do you want to help make the sets? And so we put him in the carpenter shop. He was building sets. He was happier doing that than mixing with producers and stuff. Yeah, he saved me my bacon twice. And we got it finished, and I thought, this looks pretty cool. And again, it was crossing fingers. George, come down and have a look at the first set. Big smile. And I said to him, you know, I like to make things personal. You know, people fly these things, they live in them. I noticed in American Graffiti, he had those big fluffy dice in Ron Howard's car. And I said, he's a gambler, we should hang some dice. That was a good idea, so I got big fluffy ones down to little silver ones. My silver were my choice, but I let George choose, and he chose the silver ones. We hung them in. We had the director of photography, who's a very important person, was grumpy and fell out with George on the very first morning of shooting, and they conversed from then on through Gary Kurtz. They're in the first shot in Star Wars, there's two, and then the DP took them out because he thought they were in his way, and they never went back.
They just disappeared.
I was telling this story on Reddit, on Ask Me Anything once, and she said, there's a text just come in saying, have you seen the Vanity Fair cover for the what was the first one? The Rise of Skywalker. What's the first one?
Force Awakens. Force Awakens.
Force Awakens. So they said the dice are in that photograph that Annie Leibovitz did. So I went and got it, and we looked, and there they were, but they were also gold. Mine was silver, but the lighting made them look gold. He'd gone out and had somebody track some down. They hung them in there. He cut that scene out. So because they weren't in that film. But then they'd remembered, and when Luke brings them and gives them to carry as a remembrance of Han Solo once he's died, they bring the dice then and give it. So these little things we did kind of became echoes. And it was the same with, you went there and you saw the cantina. When we were there, it was a dusty square, and John Barry, the designer, could not afford to do Tatooine, so he designed the Little Prince for Stanley Donen before that, and said, George, if we go to Tunisia, it's very, very inexpensive, it's not far from London, crews are cheap, and I think it's Tatooine. And so George went, and there it was. He didn't do anything but add some domes on the top outside the cantina and made a door. The rest of it, I dressed electronics and vehicles and whatever we could put in. And in the square was a beautiful olive tree, and it completely spoiled the look. And so John Barry drew a crashed spaceship the size of a 747.
It's really huge, right?
It's huge. And that hid the olive tree, because we couldn't cut it down. These are poor farmers, you know, and it was a living for someone. It's never really noticed. They just walk past it backwards and forwards. But I thought, what am I going to do here? And we had found, it was the most expensive thing the art department got, was a press that could make like PVC pressings that we made C-3PO from, but the Death Star was made out of panels. They were just flexible panels, but they were stapled onto a wooden frame, and it created that whole Death Star really cheaply. I grabbed a load of those. I thought these would be good. I was loading scrap onto trucks, which again they thought I was mad. Why are you putting scrap to take to Tunisia? But there wasn't any there. There was nothing. Everything was used. And I got up on a ladder and stuck these panels on, and burnt it with a torch. I did it myself, and then we painted it down, and it became that crashed spaceship. And at the same time, John had drawn the skeleton when R2-D2 and C-3PO land of a dinosaur, of an animal, huge. I thought that was really cool because it gives a history to a planet when they're there. And I said, sorry, that's beyond my budget, I can't do that. And the prop man one day said to me, here, there's a torch, go in the attic, I got to clear everything out, I need the space now, go and see if there's anything there. I wish I knew what I did now. There was the Bounty from Mutiny on the Bounty, the model, a huge one they used on the tank. They all got junked.
Just clearing all that out.
Clearing out, and
So
everything
it's
got junked. There were
coincidence.
old film cans and so much stuff. I didn't have a time because I saw a full-size dinosaur with fiberglass from this film. One of our dinosaurs is missing. And I got it in the parking lot, there it was. So I said, stick that on the truck, and we put it into the desert. This is how we linked up because at the end of the shoot, Robert Watts, who's the production controller, said, we can't afford to take that back. I just leave it there. And I said, are you sure? He said, it's fiberglass, leave it in the desert.
Because it was going to be thrown away in England.
It would have
Anyway.
been junked, yeah. So
Bring it all back home.
yeah,
Throw it away.
yeah.
It's incredible.
And you found it. But there was, I mean, everything was kind of made like this. The big set was the hold set, which ate up my junk. It looked terrible. When you start doing this, and I was praying people wouldn't look coming on the stage, and it looked terrible. We kept putting more in. I was ordering more truckloads of junk, and we eventually, it was almost like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis. This thing suddenly looked like a ship, and we oiled it down and put all the basic kind of lettering on and made it look like what it should be. And I remember then seeing, my worries went at that point, my nervousness, because I could see people coming in the set and their eyes were wide open thinking, how do we do this? This is a ship, a real one. And I did the same with the exterior of the Millennium Falcon. We had to tie all that stuff together. We made C-3PO work somehow. And if you come down, Les and I were sent down to the desert to be in charge for the shoot. That's where we started. So John Barry called Les Dillon, the other art, who's a basic working art director, and me into the office, locked the door, and I thought, what's going on? We're going to get fired. And he said, listen, the special effects boys are always going how great it's all going to be. He said, I don't trust that radio-controlled R2-D2 is ever going to work. You're going to be in the desert, miles from anywhere. Make a lightweight one in fiberglass that you could pull on a fishing wire and keep it secret. So we did. We stuck
The
it on
secret
the truck.
R2-D2. I love it. There's the droid, and then there's the covert droid.
We stuck it on the truck. The only person who knew was Gary Kurtz. And first shot ever is R2-D2. Well, it was supposed to be my big droid that was done like a Chris Foss painting, being lowered down. It took too much time and too difficult, so George cut that and started with R2-D2 coming out. The radio control, out he came, crashed over, hit another droid, the whole thing cut. The special effects, who obviously had this excuse that always worked in London, he went in front of the crew and he said, oh, it's the blooming taxis. They've upset my radio control.
He's so used to saying that about production.
Yeah.
Why his radio control stuff is not working.
We were 3 miles in the desert from a sleepy town that had one taxi and the rest were camels and donkey cars. They all looked at me, and George did, and Gary said, can you get the filament out, monofilament, which is an American term. Still he didn't understand. He looked at me and said, what do they want? I said, the fishing wire. So we got our R2-D2 out and put down a track, flat boards, put a bit of sand on the front. Nearly all of the walking ones with 3 legs were done pulling fishing wire on the chute. Except for once it worked going down the valley. That was the only time the radio control worked on a rider shot, but otherwise And if you look now you know all of this, look at that scene, it's all about R2-D2, Uncle Owen buying the robots. He's barely in it. George, as an editor, knew before it crashed or before anything happened, he had enough footage just to cut him to be part of it.
And there was so little footage that was usable. And this, when years later, it was 25 years after he shot the film, I had George to myself in his office at the ranch, and we were talking about his experience in Tunisia, and he was still upset about it. He was still unhappy, because I was rhapsodizing about how the landscapes really inspired the artists, and it had so much, and he's like, I just hate it, I wish it was all on the back lot. And he talked about how he did not get what he wanted, and so what Roger's saying, it's true how limited it was. So even in that one scene, there's a repeat shot of where R2 turns his dome. They had to use that same shot twice in that scene because there just wasn't anything else.
Yeah, and C-3PO, the first time he ever put on the costume fully was actually walking onto the chute, and the leg broke. We were using gold tape to stick him together.
This is out on the salt flat, so this is shot Algeria. It was the first time Anthony Daniels fully suits up. And I've seen the behind-the-scenes footage where C-3PO looks like he's brand new from the factory, perfect head to toe. And that's when Anthony's getting to try out the costume and finding out, there are edges that are going to cut you through and move yourself. And it's just amazing to me that those problems got solved practically in front of the camera.
We only realised then once he got it on, he couldn't pee. He had it on all day. And during the whole time, the preparation, everything, we used to meet at 7 o'clock. We were doing like 15, 20-hour days to get this thing ready. In my office, I had a kettle, and I had chocolate McVitie biscuits, which the entire film industry runs on in England, and I had some milk. So they would all meet, the heads, the art department, because we never had time to speak during the day. We were so consumed getting everything ready. So we would meet and have tea. It's a funny story, you don't know this. I would always take a tea bag and put it in and take it out. And Frank Bruton and the others, the construction guys, they would put 6 tea bags in until there was an oil slick on the top. And one day he was looking at me and said, "You just frightened the water boy." But they were saying, his eyes, like, what are we going to do about the eyes? And I said, I personally hate eyes on robots because you can always see the person behind. And I said, I had an idea. I was watching last night on television where they put the suspects in a viewing room with a one-way mirror, and so they can't see who's the one who's accusing them. And I said, if we did a one-way mirror, and they went, "Oh, that's a good idea. You handle that."
So they got.
I had enough to do. I opened my mouth, so I did. I got a little company to one-way mirror them, and I made the little brass bits. Everything was fine, and I thought Ralph had them lighting up, and it's a really good idea. They get hot. Anything I could think of, Christmas bulbs, and again, by chance, I'd seen a program, one of the early documentaries on when they put a camera inside a body. And I got my buyer and I said, listen, these bulbs must be cold. You've got to find them. He went searching around hospitals. He found them. And I got 3 of them, which made it worked. I drilled out the center that was like a pupil, and there was a tiny bit he could see through, apart from the one-way mirrored piece. But then we had to bury the battery inside him as well, somewhere. And of course, batteries in those days didn't last very long. That was another problem for him. But it kind of worked. And
It's one little touch of vitality, but it brings him to life without the
all the roughness kind of worked, but it worked on film. I was at the ranch when George was digitizing all the 6 movies to go out on release, and he took me down and he said, look at it, you could see the gaffer tape on Darth Vader's neck, you could see the gold tape, everything showed up once it digitized, it became so clear. He had to go through the 6 films and virtually redo all the effects on every one of them for digital. It was a final film, yeah, and he also wanted that dusty western look, so he had a filter on there, which was another bone of contention with the director of photography, who actually reported into Fox and said, this is rubbish and you can't do this. It was literally that first shot where George was looking, and we have a Chewy, which is where you look through, the director can look and line up the shots. And Gil Taylor walked over to him and said, what are you doing? And he said, I'm lining up the shot. He said, that's my job, I do that. You look after the actors, I'll do that. And that was it, that was where the fractions began. He's an independent filmmaker, that's what you do, you know. And this film was, as you know, John Jimson, when he edited the film together during the shoot, he complained so much to Fox, the special effects complained so much, Gil Taylor complained so much, that Alan Ladd came over ostensibly to fire George off his own movie.
It was that close.
And Alan Ladd was wise, and when we took him round the sets, he saw and thought, this is quite what they're saying, there's something here. And then George explained, and the English editor had cut it like a conventional film, big wide shot, mid shot, tight shot, over the shoulder, all conventional. George never did that, it was documentary style, and he explained that to Alan Ladd. And actually, Gary Kurtz told me, I didn't know this, they screened the footage that the editor had done in Pinewood in the theatre. And of course, you imagine, so Dave Prowse is going, I come from Somerset, so how do we go now? We got to get the stormtroopers going. He thought it was his voice being used. The stormtroopers were stuck together, they were clanking on the set, that nothing was working, robots were being pulled along. It didn't look very good. And I didn't know this, but he said Alan Ladd watched it, came out, said to Gary, how much have you spent so far? How much is there rest to spend for the effects? And he said, I'm going to walk around the stage and I'll come back and tell you at the end of it whether you're going to continue or we're going to dump this. And he just trusted George. So, you know, George says now, I owe the film to Alan Ladd, really, that we actually got it made. And it was an interesting time.
So that cut survives. The John Gibson cut survives. It was at Skywalker Ranch when I was there. And I knew I was there at a golden age where George is still up in his office creating Star Wars. And it was this amazing special time when we were getting ready to reactivate the franchise and preparing the prequels. And I was there under Rick McCallum's protection. And so when I learned that there's not only the archives that we all know of the objects and the costumes and everything, there were the film archives, then I said, so what kinds of things are in the film archives? And I learned that this John Jimson cut of Star Wars was there. And no one had been allowed to see it because it was something that, you know, almost got George Lucas fired off his own movie. But I wanted to see what was this alternate view of Star Wars. So I had this thing shown to me before anyone could shut it down. And it's Star Wars from a different point of view. It's like a documentary of the movie that we all know, because it was so much different camera angles, different takes. It was the same action happening, but the coverage was exactly as you described, where it's very conventional. The editing was not part of the art. It was just, here's what's happening. And it makes everything look boring. Like, just here's this robot going this way, and then people turn that way, and then they walk, and then they come back here. And it's just, what in the world is this? And if you look at Star Wars that way, without John Williams' music, without the creative editing to guide your emotion and your attention, it looked bizarre.
It was an act of faith. Yeah. Then I guess, you know, now something I made for $15 is the most iconic prop in the history of cinema. Now, the one thing that evaded me was the lightsaber, which then was called a laser sword. And
so it's just laser sword in the script.
Laser sword, that's all I knew, a laser sword. And King Arthur, that was my favorite story, and I knew Excalibur, and that's the icon of that legend is the sword. It's got the power, and I thought this will be it. I've got to justify this weapon of these Jedis. I couldn't find anything, and the time was getting nearer to Tunisia, and then I tackled Luke's binoculars, and I had some junk camera bits, still camera and a movie camera, and so I took 3 pieces of them and stuck them together with super glue again, and I thought that looks okay.
But you had done quite nice drawings, actually, of binoculars.
That was the only thing I did.
Was that the only?
It's the only drawings I ever did. I thought, how am I going to make this work? So I did drawings.
So
And,
if there had been time to make the movie conventionally, you would have been able to build them according to your
yeah,
design, right?
if there
It was
wasn't all the
interesting
money.
to see that.
There was no money to do it. So
But that was in your head, though. But that's cool.
Yeah, and I thought to make the audience understand what they are, I'd get 2 camera lenses and stick them on the front. So I went to the camera hire shop that his friend David French ran. They sold cameras, everything. We got all our equipment from them, and I got the lenses that I could stick on the front. And I said, David, listen, I've got to make a weapon. Is there anything you could think of I might be able to look at? And he said, oh, what about a torch? And you've seen because there's no reference. Everything else, there was something in Ralph McQuarrie I could hang on to, but they look like lances. And actually Darth Vader and the Stormtroopers had them in Ralph McQuarrie's versions. The special effects made them up turn like blank torches, and they look terrible.
Have you,
George?
How many people have seen those prototype lightsabers that John Steers' special effects team made up? And this is back when the lightsaber was wielded like a rapier. It was a one-handed weapon, because in the early visions, you had a shield too. There were shields with the lightsabers in the earliest vision of this, because they were still searching for what's the archetype that you pattern it on. And so the Stormtroopers, she had shields, and they had a one-handed lightsaber. Well, that made it this little thing. There's no room for any individuality. You see in the famous Ralph McQuarrie painting where Darth Vader in his prototype version is bearing down, and the early Luke Skywalker character's got breathing gear. You'll see the sabers, but like Roger said, there's not much design there. There's sort of like a little radar dish on top of a pommel it just looks like a flashlight. And so when John Steers faithfully represented anything you could get out of those Ralph McQuarrie paintings, it was just completely uninspiring. And that's what it was going to be. That would have been the lightsaber. But Roger was the one who was thinking Excalibur. Like, this is not just another piece of the film, like we need a light switch and we need a battery. He was thinking, we need a symbol. So what's worthy of being that symbol? And the pieces that John Steers made would have worked fine. They looked decent, they were well made, but they didn't have that iconic symbolism. And so it was, you brought that to the search.
Well, he said go and look under the shelf. There's a load of boxes there, because he hired out, the Graflex camera was a press camera that was used in America and Britain, and it worked. It was a beautiful object, and it had the ability to take a shot, and they quickly put another bulb in, so it was like early paparazzi. He had a load of those because he rented them out to period films. And he said, look in that box. And I pulled the first box out, and there in this tissue paper, it was like slow motion music rising. There was this object, which I thought, there it is. This is beautiful. I could use it like this, because you didn't know what it was. I got 3 of them. I raced back to the studio. I had some T-strip left over from the blaster that put round. So I thought, if I make a handle, that'll change it. And I stuck that round. And I was always taking things apart in the office, and I'd taken apart I think it's a Texas Instrument calculator, and inside there was a bubble strip that illuminated the numbers and magnified them, and it fitted beautifully in the clip. It was the only thing I didn't like. There was a clip that clipped it on, and I thought that looks like something the Force would work. And I called George over, and it was very heavy. And again, this huge smile. I mean, he just held it, and I thought, there it is. So all he wanted was a D-ring or a clip on the end. The first time we see it is on Luke's belt in the desert. So I'd hired a friend of mine who made metal sculptures out of scrap. And it was the first appointment ever in the industry. We hired him as a special assistant prop maker to me. Again, he started, there was no money for equipment, it was a new prop thing, so he had a box of stuff at home, and he brought it in and stuck the D-ring on the end of it. And in another of our chocolate biscuit munching, tea drinking in the morning, there was a long discussion about the blade, because no one knew how to do it. And I'd done some art installations we painted with front projection paint that glowed. So I suggested that, and again, oh, yeah, you do that. There was a big meeting whereby I explained to the special effects boys that if we just got a wooden dowel and painted it, we could stick it in my handle, and I made them a second handle that they could drill out and do that with. Again, the DP, that won't work, I don't want it on my set, the lighting's going to spoil my beautiful set lighting. And then George overrode and she said, no, do it. And so John Steers here, where he was clever, this is one that was made recently that was quite interesting, but it's exactly illustrates, it's not the right lightsaber, this is Obi-Wan's, but he put a motor inside the Graplex, and then he set it off center a little bit, so it kind of vibrated. I think this one might work. He just brought it to show me here. And if you do it with a camera light on it, this glows immediately, and it worked. So the other thing that the decision was made was that based on the samurai fights, the swords shouldn't go through each other, even though they're light blades, they should hit. So when Alec Guinness and Dave Prowse did the only lightsaber fight, they were hitting each other with it. They broke so many, I can't tell you, because they were only wooden downs, but it kind of worked.
It lights up when you take a flash of you holding it.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, the camera sees it differently.
Camera sees it, yeah. And some of that's still in the film. And then, you know, in those days there was rotoscoping, which they went and hand painted every frame, and they put a little bit of extra blade in and stuff. But
you can see that effect in when Luke is training in the Millennium Falcon hold, and we get a few shots of him close. You can see the little bit of shimmer that the blade has, and that it had, to me, an extra bit of vitality in the first movie. There was something indefinable about the blade. If it's just a special effect, you painted it on, it looks nice, but there was something like, how is it vibrating? I really liked that. And then sometimes during the saber battles, you can see little fragments of the front projection paint coming off. And it's like, it looks as if, well, when the lightsabers clash, you know, something's given off.
Pieces, yeah.
And there's a little bit of physical effect going on, which I thought really added to it.
Yeah, well, it's the joy of doing everything for real, really. I think it kind of, it somehow gets through to the audience that you're believing everything, and that was the goal, really, to try to make that happen.
And doing it for real, like you said, his guns would fire blank charges. So when Luke and Leia are in the chasm where they're going to do the swing and they're fighting it out with the stormtroopers, these blanks are going off, and it gives the actor something to react to, but you see a flash also, and then as that battle goes on, it's filling up with smoke. So by the time they're going to do their swing, there's a lot of smoke, and you get the feeling that like a battle has happened here.
There was a problem with that.
A little bit.
Well, the first time they used by the stormtroopers, and the ejector on the side is on the left. And when they were firing, they were hitting the other stormtroopers, the blanks when they came out. So the kind of primitive self and safety at that time banned us from doing it anymore. And George had to put the flash on afterwards.
So that's why it's in some scenes and not others.
Yeah,
That got banned.
yeah.
But it looks so good.
I know it does. That's part of the reason of doing it with real guns, because you can do it. They're blanks. They're perfectly safe if they're correctly inspected.
And even as a kid, I noticed, like your point about, you said you didn't like the science fiction guns because they're lightweight. They look like they have no presence. Even as a kid, I remembered when Leia gets tossed the blaster in the detention block, or they're down in the cell bay, and you see her catch the blaster, you can see that it's got some real heft. And that's, I mean, a weapon, you pick up a weapon and it's got physical presence.
Yeah.
And that's just, the actor, you can't fake that, the way it's held. So I could see that even as a kid, that like, it has that presence, and I think it made a big difference.
Yeah, and each one kind of, it's like the bowcaster fitted a tall, hairy Chewbacca, and then I kind of tried to distinguish the characters, which is why with the Tusken Raiders, I gave them, I found in Baptist that to Tokyo Warrior stick, and I thought this is really great, and I had to change it, so I put an old piece of they'd made up a medieval mace in Baptist, and I drilled the end and put that in there, so it changed it. We only had one of those.
This baffled me for years, because it only came out late. We finally figured out it's a Fijian Totokyo warrior club. That's the wooden part of a gaffy stick. The other end is this mace, but until I talked to Roger, I never understood, because it's a really badly made mace. And it's a background mace that Baptiste had for when you've got 100 people in the army and the barbarians are running around or whatever. It's just for the background, so that's why it's crudely made. So I can see, like, it's supposed to represent a mace, like a traditional mace, and yet you can see the weld marks on it. And so that was fascinating.
Well, they were kind of wild people who lived in the desert. They wouldn't have sophisticated.
Yeah, so it fits perfectly.
Yeah.
It was very curious about, because this prop shows this really fine detail where it's all carved out around the club.
Yeah.
The ring around the spike, the Fijians carve it very finely. And yet this other part is very crude. So it works perfectly for the Tusken Raiders, but I wondered, how did the prop maker do that? And so it wasn't until he explained that Baptiste has this range of everything. If you need an army, we've got hundreds of these low-grade versions.
Yeah.
If you need hero versions, we've got these up here.
Yeah, exactly.
Putting all the pieces together is possible
Yeah.
in a place like that, where you can be serendipitous. You can't go in and say, I want this, this, and this. You don't know until you see it. So I think the opportunity to browse like that was something that enriched the film.
Yeah, it was. And then we gave them the old kind of blunderbuss as well, so I thought that would be suitable. And the advantage was, and this is why there's so little, the guns, like all of the Sterlings, when we finished shooting, all went back. They were rented, and we couldn't afford to buy them, so we had the duplicate ones that were made for stunts and stuff. Everything was destroyed or went back afterwards. But that was a way that we could get it done. There were so many things like that, and it was just endless stories. That the garbage room was particularly difficult because they were going to be in water, and you usually use polystyrene lumps, which I could paint, but it breaks and it would be white. So I found a way to inject it. I got every bit of rubber, anything I could find that was soft that would do it. And then, of course, that huge pole that Harrison has to hold the walls as they come in. I had bought so much drain piping and water piping because it was cheap. I had racks of it. So I got 2 of the drain pipes and found some piece, I don't know what it was, that I could stick it together. It was so long it would never stay still. And that was the second time. And Harrison came down, I said, listen, I need your help again here. He's great. He said, oh, don't worry, I'll deal with that. And made it work.
So it was, what he contributed is just the way he handled it? Or
Yeah,
what?
the way he held it straight, because it's not, normally it would just bend. Any other actor, it would have been floppy and doing this. So he held it so that it looked like a serious piece of metal that would hold the doors open. It didn't.
Tell them a little bit more about with the lightsaber. So it's Roger brings to the creation of the props the idea that it's reflecting the personality. So the stormtroopers have one look; it's a different look for Han Solo. The Tusken Raiders have a weapon that reflects their approach. The lightsabers were all identical in Ralph McQuarrie's paintings. Everybody's got exactly the same piece. If you have a lightsaber, it's just this thing, whether you're Luke or Darth Vader or anyone. It's Roger's bringing to this the idea that it should reflect character. So you just had that thought naturally when you started it?
Yeah, Luke, once I got it, I knew what a lightsaber was. Once I got that handle.
And it looks so perfect. So when did you look at, because it's so perfect, when did you look at that and think, and yet I want to design something different for the other two characters?
Yeah, because Obi-Wan, I thought, he's a desert nomad. He's kind of, it should be different, and it should be a bit kind of more ancient. That's a good example. But the and we found the.
It's got more texture to it.
I never knew what I was doing. I found this grenade with a thing on it, and I thought that would be cool for the barrel. Now all the fans, I know exactly what I used. There was a piece of a Derwent, these engines that we stripped down, the Rolls-Royce engines, that was part of that. And then it just fitted a tap, a faucet handle on the end. It looked quite good. So I learned something last weekend that I never knew before, because David showed me his perfect, beautiful replica, and I said, "What have you got on the end? C or H, hot or cold?" And what did you have?
Well, that one was neuter. That was not in binary.
Right. So he had neuter. So then one of the fans said to me, "Why don't you have a look closely at the film?" Because I thought, would I have done that? I would have taken that off. And there, I looked at it last night, and it's missing. There was no cap. I took it off. So that,
mine's correct.
No one.
It should be.
Well, it didn't even have a cap. If you look, it's empty. You can see inside something dark. Yeah, there's no cap on it. I'm learning things all the time. So that I learned now. And Darth Vader's we did give to the special effects boys with pieces, so they would make one that was suitable to the people who make the Death Star would have much more of an engineering kind of way of doing it. So that one we did like that.
All those years ago, there was a magazine, I don't know how many people remember Fantastic Films. That magazine did a spread analyzing the weapons of Star Wars. And that was the first piece that again taught me you can look into these things and see how it was crafted. And that person was trying to figure out, what had you made? Was this gun, and was it this piece put together? And they'd done quite a good job of tracing that back. And that was where they were trying to discern the three different kinds of lightsabers that you had made. And it was evident even then that you've got this silver lightsaber for Luke that reflects the purity of that character.
Yeah.
You've got the more complex one for Obi-Wan that has a balance and complexity to it. And then Darth Vader's is the only one where the emitter shroud is black.
Yeah.
And the ring around the middle is black. And yet, it was interesting. The whole lightsaber is not just black. It's not black all over. It's black with silver. And so we were wondering, even then, does that mean there's hope for this character? Is that what that's symbolizing? And of course, the trilogy ends up, that's exactly what's going on. But it's perfectly reflected in the prop from the beginning because you were tuning it to the character.
Yeah. Yeah, I put a lot of effort into doing all of that. Again, I didn't want, because most science fiction films were just like, oh, we designed that and then we'll throw that in.
And all the lightsabers were the same. And yet,
the same,
and what
guns
we
the same.
get. So because he came up with the three separate lightsabers, when it came time for me to do the visual dictionary, I thought, well, it must be that every Jedi must build their own lightsaber.
Yeah.
So up until this point, lightsabers were just something that came out of the factory. But because he had designed them to be individual, I thought they must each one be handcrafted. And when they went from being a one-handed rapier to a two-handed, like a samurai sword, well, that gave the idea of it should be something that not just anybody could make. Like samurai sword, the guys who forge those, there's a special technique. Only a few people know how to do that. The lightsaber should be like that. And so that's where I came up with the idea of putting a crystal in the lightsaber to power it. That gives it an organic element that you can't just stamp out in a factory. But I only come up with that crystal because he came up with the three different lightsabers that reflect the different characters. If that richness hadn't been there from the beginning, I would never have had that idea. And so I love how these pieces fit together over the generations.
Yeah.
You don't see where it's going to go. So the seed that I plant by putting the crystals in and creating the ritual that a Jedi has to go through, of building the lightsaber and aligning the crystal, and now that's going to take it farther. And you don't know where it's going to go. But when you get the opportunity, the people that try to put their all into it, it plants seeds.
Yeah, if you look, none of us knew the skeleton we left in the desert there, that became the Crate Dragon. And the crashed spaceship, every single Star Wars from then on had crashed spaceships as part of the landscape. Rey now lives in one, and scavengers and that. Those things did feed, and I praise and thank God to Dave Filoni every day, because he brought all this back. And when he did The Mandalorian, he's so concerned with how those details. And I was watching the Obi-Wan series, and it came to the end, and I was going, what's he going to do? Because Obi-Wan digs up the lightsaber because he's got to give it to Luke. And what I didn't like personally, the second film, Return of the Jedi, the set decorator, who I knew, was better off at doing period films. He was definitely not a science fiction ever. So for some reason, whether it was laziness or he thought they'd come off, the T-strip, he cut pieces out of them and they stuck rivets around it, and to me it made it human made. You would never have a rivet on a Jedi's mystical weapon.
I had to fight my illustrators in the Cutaways books. They were constantly wanting to put rivets on all of the equipment inside the ships that we were revealing. And because I always tried to work back to the original creators. And so because something like that, I knew a Roger Christian piece does not show rivets. So I was trying to ban rivets in the spaceships. And
that carries right through. It carried right through. Unfortunately, that one with the rivets in it. And then I was waiting, actually, what's he going to dig up? And Dave went back to the original. That's what came out without the rivets. And he's been anal about retaining what George did. He's George #2 really now. George trained him how everything was done with the characters, everything, and
it's respect, isn't it?
Yeah, it's respect. And George, it's interesting. It leads to something else. George's ability, and I realized going through all this, writing the books, doing this documentary, that his ability, he hired people who knew how to do the job. I was fairly junior. I'd made my way up pretty quickly to set decorating. I wasn't going through the 30 years of drafting and getting to being an art director at the end of it. By then you're wiped out of all creativity. And it kind of, George picked people. John Barry designed Clockwork Orange. He was still young for a designer, and he designed Superman. I mean, the first things like that before he sadly died. But so he had that. I certainly had that. John Mollo, the costume designer, had never costume designed anything. He was a kind of lieutenant for designers who could arm Gandhi. He could do all of this. So
military costume story.
Yeah, and look at the ILM boys. They were they were like beach bums, and George had never said to anybody, "This is what you've got to do. This is how you do it." He hired people with scripts that could never be made, and every script is like that. It was beyond the boundaries of what could be done, but he figured he'd hired the people who would figure it out, and none of us were so entrenched in our work that we wouldn't say, "No, Gov, you can't do it like that. This is how we always do it. It always works." We would find ways of doing it. And if you look at Joe Johnson, is a classic example. He was a beach kid, bum, who needed a job. He had no money and saw an advert for a job, and he took the job. They found out that he could make models and he could do storyboards. It was an inherent talent that no one knew that he had. And Ralph McQuarrie's ship, and I was just taking photographs of one down there now, the one that Ralph McQuarrie drew, he built the first model of as the Millennium Falcon, and it's exactly the Eagle from Space 1999. And George saw it and said, "We can't use it, that's the Eagle." And he came out with this thing. He said, "Why don't you make it like a hamburger?" And there are many kind of urban truths about that, how that came about. I think the one from George was that he had a hamburger half eaten on the flight back from London, and Rick thought, oh, do it like that. And the only thing he used, he liked the cockpit, so he stuck it on the side.
From the original design.
Yeah, so in those days, there was no emails, there was none of any of this stuff. We had a pouch that from the model department in ILM, they would send us photographs that we'd get 3 days later, and we would send back to them. So they photographed his model of the Millennium Falcon, and this is not the correct way you do it. You build the real one first from drawings, and then they make the model. He'd made that model first. The photographs came to us. John Barry designed it and got it built, the basic of it. And then we got one of these messages came back and said, you built in the mistake. And we, what are you talking about? He said, no, the day they photographed it, I put some of the pieces they'd stuck on from the model kits I didn't think looked right, and I pulled it off and they photographed it. So in the Millennium Falcon somewhere there's just glue. Yeah, there's glue and pieces missing where that was. So I think it's near the cockpit. I met Joe Johnson later and we discussed it, but we couldn't either of us remember exactly where it was.
Well, we got to wrap up.
Oh, okay.
To the time, but so I think if you've got questions, come
Yeah,
and
if
see
there's
us
any questions,
at our
yeah,
table,
or down
because
the table.
Roger loves to take questions, and so do I. So we've got a table downstairs,
Yeah.
and somewhere hidden in the back is a labyrinth. But we thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much.